Well, they say it's racist to do anything. I had a Diet Mountain Dew yesterday and one today. I'm sure they're going to call that racist too, but...
Props to our director and colleague Billy for supplying us all with Diet Mountain Dew, gents. When was the last time you had a Mountain Dew, JM?
I probably had one within like the last couple years, but it's not a regular... It's a once in a blue moon occurrence, or once in a dew moon occurrence.
Oh, you didn't do that.
We will never give up. We will never concede and be bigger, better, and bolder than ever before.
We are not going back.
Welcome to the Trump Trials Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey, and today I am with James Hohmann and J.M. Rieger. Welcome to you both. Here's the news. Kamala Harris has surged into the national consciousness after taking the torch from President Joe Biden in the campaign for the White House. She has secured enough delegate support to officially lock up the Democratic presidential nomination. So now, the big question, as this Veep runs for president, who will she pick as her vice presidential running mate? And former President Donald Trump is wrestling with the sudden change in tenor of the campaign. He's spending the ad money, but just how is he adjusting to running against a different opponent? And as his vice presidential pick, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance struggling a bit out of the gate. Well, let's start with the monumental news on the Democratic side of the ticket. President Biden spoke to the nation in an Oval Office address on Wednesday night, explaining his decision to withdraw from the race and really starting the sunset on his political career. And Kamala Harris seems destined now to be the Democratic nominee. You know, just 2 weeks ago, when Democrats were urging Biden to step down, there was fear that there would be a void, a confusion, maybe even political chaos as Democrats tried to figure out who could replace him. But now that void, it's filled with Kamala. There is no void, JM. How did she lock up support so fast?
There were 3 weeks of kind of an unknown there post-debate, right, with all these calls for Biden to step out from Democrats. And then in less than 72 hours since Biden dropped out, Harris has already basically wrapped up the nomination with all the support. Anyone who would have challenged her in a hypothetical open contested convention has come out and support her and came out and supported her very quickly. And on top of that, even folks like Lloyd Doggett, who was the first Democrat to call for Biden to step out.
The Texas congressman.
The Texas Democratic congressman. Even he initially on Sunday when Biden dropped out said, oh, yeah, maybe we should have a mini primary and play this out. And even he has now come out and supported Harris. It's a remarkable stretch. And in that short amount of time, we've gone from Democrats being divided in many ways on who would lead their ticket. And now they are in some ways more united than ever.
James, do we know how she did that so quickly?
It bears all the hallmarks of a relief rally, as they call it on Wall Street. She did it quickly because no one would run against her. And there was a desire to avoid chaos. We're just over 100 days out from the election. There is an understanding that as the VP, she should be next in line. And she had solid support from the Congressional Black Caucus. And no one was willing to sort of get the blame for if they ran against her and lost, and then she lost, it would seem like they had bloodied her. So I think people were sort of willing to rally around. And then the people who could have been potential challengers all decided that they had better odds of becoming her running mate as VP than beating her for the nomination itself.
She's raised so much money. The campaign is like, I mean, it's transformational, really.
It's record-breaking. It's $250 million if you include the campaign and the super PAC. It's the best 3 days ever for Act Blue, the Democratic fundraising platform. And it's also coming as a lot of donors had said they were going to withhold money from Biden, especially from the Future Forward super PAC. And now all that money has materialized. And it really is so many people who were depressed about the choice now feel excited and animated and engaged. And we'll see if that lasts. But certainly the Democratic base is consolidated around her, and there are very few holdouts.
Yeah,
and the money also matters because unlike with Biden, those were two known quantities, Biden and Trump. So there was this thinking in a sense that the money maybe mattered a little less because everyone knows who they are. This is a situation where as the Harris campaign said this week, this race is very fluid now, and Harris has an opportunity, a window here to sort of define herself. So that money actually may be even more important than the fundraising hauls we've been talking about throughout the campaign.
How soon can she and her team start spending it on her, right? Pivoting to her, because there's this vacuum right now where if they don't hustle, Trump can define her, right? Trump can use the airways and his footprint that's already moving to define her.
Yeah. So despite all the fundraising we're talking about, Trump and company are outspending Harris and company more than 25-1 on the airwaves this week. I heard from someone who's in Philadelphia, was watching a Phillies game and saw 3 anti-Harris ads run during the game and nothing from the Biden team. Part of what's going on inside the campaign is that Mike Donnellan, who is one of Biden's longtime advisors, he was the ad guy. And one of the reasons some of the Biden world people didn't want Biden to drop out is they have tens of millions of dollars of ad contracts and commissions and cuts that they're getting of all these things. And so right now, the Harris operation, Donnellan still has a role in the campaign, but they're trying to reportedly get Jim Margolis, who made Obama ads, to come make Harris ads. They finally did release this morning, a sort of announcement video. It's like a web video, a lot of fast cuts. It includes footage of Harris in Wisconsin on Tuesday, and loud cheers and energy for her. But that's not a campaign commercial. And it's not just Trump who's on the air. It's also, for example, in Pennsylvania, Dave McCormick, the Republican Senate candidate, is up with an ad trying to tie his Democratic opponent, Senator Bob Casey, to Kamala Harris and saying Kamala Harris is really liberal and Casey supports her. So she'll have the Democratic convention in a few weeks, which is a great opportunity for her to put herself forward and reintroduce herself to the American people, do a lot of like biographical stuff. But there is a risk that she gets defined among these people. I think the other thing, the last point I'll make on this is the last several weeks, the last month since the debate, there were a lot of the double doubters, a lot of moderate Republicans, people who supported Mitt Romney proudly, maybe didn't vote in 2016, voted for Biden in 2020, who I think had been coming to terms with the idea that they would vote for Trump this year reluctantly, but that if it was a Trump-Biden matchup, they'd back Trump. And once you mentally get to the space where, okay, I can vote for Trump, now it's doable, but it's hard because now Harris has to convince those people who for the last month were like, okay, if it's Biden versus Trump, I'll support Trump, that they shouldn't support Trump and that they should support her. So it's a harder lift because Biden dragged out the decision for as long as he did.
So how's polling looking? It's still so early, JM. I know we're only 100 days out till the election, but how is polling looking for Kamala Harris?
There were 11 post-debate polls in our Washington Post polling average looking at kind of a Harris-Trump matchup. And does
post-debate. So we're talking
post-debate, talking that specific window. She trails Trump by about an average of 1.5 points. Biden was trailing by 1.9 points. This is nationally. Obviously, the caveat there is we expect the race to be determined in these kind of 7 battleground states, right? The other issue for Harris here is that, similar to Biden and Trump, her disapproval is also kind of net underwater double digit, right? An average of about 12, 13 points underwater in terms of disapproval. That's why when we're talking about this window here, this we've heard this phrase, this honeymoon period for her candidacy. That and if she can stretch it to the convention, then we would expect conventional wisdom would say you get a bump post-convention. So if she can kind of define herself in a way that James was just talking about, picking off some of those voters, and we've seen some polling that more folks are now saying they're undecided in some polling over this week than were before, which is actually a good sign for Harris because there's an idea that she can pluck some of those folks, that it's not as baked in as it was with Biden and Trump. So there are some numbers that are shaping up good for the Harris campaign, but this is still going to be a neck and neck, likely toss-up race depending on how things shape up.
I also think it's just so different when it's a theoretical matchup than when it's like you're actually faced with the matchup. So I think we have to interpret those polls through the lens of time, and just like it's with hindsight, we can be like, of course, Biden passed it to the torch to Kamala Harris, and of course she's the nominee. 2 weeks ago, we didn't know that. I mean, it would all seem like it could be just a big, confusing, exciting, dynamic, but confusing, messy, crazy process. And now it's happened. So what about some key voting groups? I'm thinking about young people. I'm thinking about Black voters, Latino voters.
Yeah, so young people are coming home to Democrats. African-American voters are meaningfully moving back toward Democrats. A lot of Trump's strategy was built around the idea that they were facing Joe Biden. And it doesn't quite work anymore. The kind of trying to reach young African-American men who thought Biden was weak and too old. These groups are sort of in play. There is this opportunity for a reset. Democrats overwhelmingly happy with Harris as the pick. Something that was really interesting in a CNN poll that came out Wednesday afternoon was they said, should Kamala Harris continue with Biden's policies or should she chart a new course? And Democratic voters were divided almost evenly. 53% said Harris should continue the Biden path. 47% said she should go her own direction. So I think part of the challenge now for Harris is you have an opportunity to distance yourself in some ways. A Democrat was joking to me after the speech last night that it would have been funny if Biden had said, inflation was all me. Harris said, don't do these things that are going to cause inflation. And I said, no. And I wish I had listened to my vice president. She has some opportunities to kind of present herself as her own person. Yeah. And she can claim some of the good achievements and maybe message better, maybe tell the story about Ukraine in a way that's different than Biden has told it. She has opportunities. And I think it is hard because you have 100 days. You don't have time for all the message testing and focus groups that you would normally. And so you kind of have to go with your gut a little bit and see what sort of works. And also this day and age is so hard because it's so tempting to respond to what the internet and social media are like telling you is great and working, a coconut meme and that works for extremely online people. But ultimately the people who are going to decide this election in the 7 states Jam's talking about are not extremely online. And so how do you tailor a message that excites the online people, but also reaches, as a Republican operative in Pennsylvania told me, the Hubert Humphrey Democrats, the lunch pail Democrats in Western Pennsylvania, who actually did really like Joe Biden and had sort of been moving toward Trump. But, ultimately at the end of the day, Biden could compete for them. How does Harris message in a way that works for them?
I'm just picturing like a mixer in Pennsylvania and someone's like, I'm a coconut Democrat. And someone else is like, I'm a Hubert Humphrey
I'm a Hubert
lunch pail Democrat. Yeah, I don't think that's how we really think of ourselves. So, it's interesting how you talk about could Biden like throw himself on the sword at the same time he's talking about how important it is to save democracy. And because he in his speech at his Oval Office address, which was this really poignant moment for this man who's spent really almost his entire adult life serving in public office. He was really talking about the things he still wants to do, curing cancer, ending wars, like saving democracy. It would have been a little bit different to be like, but also it's all my fault. So let's talk about this sunset moment of Joe Biden's career and what it means for him to still have 6 months in office, James.
He is a lame duck now, and that is both limiting, but also potentially liberating. He isn't going to get anything else through Congress. The House Republicans just recessed today until after Labor Day. So they're off for like 42 days. There's not really like a legislative window. And so that means...
there never was. There never was going to be a legislative window up until the election.
An election year win.
Right. But now it's not like he could have another 4 years.
Exactly. Right? Mm-hmm. And also like people aren't going to take tough political votes for you if it's not in their interest, if you're not going to be around next year. That said, you can focus on foreign policy. Like if he could bring an end to the war in Gaza, it'd be a huge legacy for him. And I think it's hard too, because he had been over the last few weeks very strategically and intentionally doing things to shore up the left because they were concerned about liberals calling on him to drop out. And in fact, it was sort of remarkable that, AOC and the Squad and Bernie Sanders were saying Biden shouldn't drop out. Well, it was the moderates who were saying Biden should go. And part of that was that the Biden people were willing to do all these really progressive things to like shore up that base.
I mean,
and
last
he doesn't
night,
have to do that anymore.
Well, but last night he did say he wants to reform the Supreme Court. Yeah. That one of his items still on the list, James.
Yeah. I mean, in addition to the foreign policy, it's like, what can he do maybe in an executive action lane, right? But even a Supreme Court reform, in theory, would have to go through Congress, or you'd have to do a constitutional amendment, which...
But he could make himself the new name and face of that. Like, that could be one of the things, a mantle that he carries. And
I actually thought that he tried to put like a bigger arc on the thing, talking about this idea of America. It's something we hear from him often, and talking about threats to democracy and whatnot. But he tried to, I think, do a step back, have more of a statesman approach to that speech, and trying to get Americans to think more broadly about the bigger issues. So when you talk about the Supreme Court stuff that he brought up, I think that's what he's trying to maybe start that ball rolling on, that to maybe move some political momentum there. Because as James said, there's little that'll happen in Congress.
He still has the bully pulpit. They can't take that away from him, and he can use that for exactly.
And he can use it in a way that either works. I mean, he'll hopefully, if you're Kamala Harris, you're certainly hoping that he does it in a way that meshes with her goals. But he can do it in a way where he can amplify what she's saying, or he can have his own unique lane, which can complement or maybe separate that. I mean, this can all be done very strategically from a political perspective. Two more things. Biden was able to do what Donald Trump was not able to do. Now, it took a long time. So let's talk about sort of if the nation will find admiration in that.
It's a really good question. In the old days, whatever that means, yes, they absolutely would have. He would have gotten sort of a bounce, and you would have had people reconsider it. And I think there's a chance that will still happen. Every single president, really ever, becomes more popular after they leave office, when they're no longer a political combatant. George W. Bush saw a pretty big spike. Now he's viewed favorably by most Democrats, which would have been mind-blowing in 2008, right? In Trump's approval rating is retrospectively way higher than it was when he left office right after January 6th. So I do think that there will be some improvement. On the other hand, if he's still seen as sort of campaigning for Harris and still like this partisan, and now is seen as infirm, I really am genuinely fascinated to see what happens to his approval rating, because it really has never been above 50% since the fall of Afghanistan, and it's been mired below 40%. And so that means the majority of Americans have disapproved of how he's doing his job, but maybe his personal favorability goes up. Maybe some of the, he's a good man kind of ratings that we ask about in our polls go up. But I'm genuinely curious to see in the next few weeks.
So I said two things. So the other part of that is there has been a lot of simmering frustration from the press corps. This is like the insider track here over the White House's perceived lack of transparency about how Biden was aging and how he was doing. And so that may continue to play out, JM, over the next couple of weeks. So while we talk about this statesman-like poignant moment, the flip side of that coin will be questions that Republicans are pushing, of course, politically, but reporters are asking too about like what was going on and why didn't we have more access to Biden? Why wasn't he doing more sit-downs with us? Why wasn't there a more open and transparent White House press office?
When he gave that solo press conference at the NATO conference, that was his first solo since, I believe, November, right? So it had been months and months and months. He's given far fewer press interviews as president than many of his recent predecessors. And we've also heard White House staff, we've heard Kamala Harris herself talk about how he's vibrant, how he's up to the job over and over and over again. I think one thing that we didn't get out of the speech last night, not necessarily that we expected it, but it probably has to come out in theory in the next 6 months here of his the remaining 6 months of his presidency, is what really went into this decision. What was the turning point for him? Was it strictly when advisors went to him and they're like, there's no path, and in a political framing, he's like, I can't lose some of these states that they're saying I might lose? Is it that when Pelosi is expressing these concerns, and we know the sway that Pelosi has in the party, that changed? What changed? Because that is, I think that kind of explanation, that detail is still lacking at this point. We still don't have a fully clear, we have reporting of what happened, but we haven't heard him really publicly walk through what was behind that decision.
And it's a great question.
process.
It's like, was it about polls and losing, or was it about like, look, I am not ready to do this for 4 more years, right? And that's exactly. And I don't think we did expect to get that. You're right. We wouldn't have. Right. That wouldn't have fit with the tone and the tenor of the speech that he was trying to give. But the questions linger and remain, and they will continue to be asked. So stay with us, because we're about to talk the Veep stakes again. We thought we were done with that, but we're back. And it is, I mean, it's kind of a fun thing to talk about, because it's one of these Washington parlor games, national parlor games. It's like you're putting together your team, your fantasy football team. So stay with us as we do our fantasy VP picks in just a moment. This is the Trump trials sidebar, and we're talking about the presidential race. Kamala Harris has secured enough delegates to become the Democratic nominee. So who will she pick to be her running mate? Where to begin? First of all, the timeline. When does this have to be done by?
The Democratic National Committee's rules group decided on a nominating process that means that Harris will officially have the nomination locked up before the convention, but that also means that she needs to name her running mate by August 7th, because that's when that person will be approved by the DNC.
Why are they doing that?
They're doing it, they claim, for ballot access reasons, but honestly, it's just because they want to avoid chaos at the convention in Chicago, and they don't want some kind of floor fight. In a perfect world, it would be great if, in the old days, they used to pick VPs in an open process, and it would be like the president didn't get to decide, but the delegates did, and you could throw your hat in the ring and have that'd be amazing to watch. But it's just, the process has changed, and now, but it really is a custom that ultimately Democratic delegates are just going to affirm and acclaim whoever Harris picks as her running mate. But it did not always used to be that way.
We saw J.D. Vance come out as Trump's running mate at the convention, right? It was we were kept in suspense until that announcement. We won't have that kind of scenario this time. But there's still going to be a lot. It's going to be in the news a lot, right? Who she will pick, who she's thinking about. Tell us about what kind of candidate Harris is looking for.
Well, based on some of the names that we've heard kind of floated out there, right? Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, Mark Kelly, senator from Arizona, husband of Gabby Giffords.
Astronaut.
Hello.
Don't forget that.
The main thing,
I just
right?
want a business card that's like Libby Casey, astronaut. But
I mean, it is one of the few areas, right, that is not fully politicized at this point, right? Astronauts are held in pretty high regard. Andy Beshear has been tossed out, right? Governor of Kentucky. Cooper, governor of North Carolina. So, these are folks. The fact that
I'm noticing they're all white men.
Yes, I think
Something they have in common. Although I will say this, a lot of them are also governors of states, right? So they've got that executive experience.
Right.
Mark Kelly accepted from that because he's a senator.
Right.
But
Swing states.
These are swing states. These are folks who they think could potentially broaden the base, right? James was just talking about Biden's appeal to kind of a certain demographic.
You can say Hubert Humphrey,
the Hubert Humphrey
Democrats.
lunch pail Democrat, right? Trademarked here, right? But like the thinking is that these folks will be able to pull in some of those voters, expand that base even more.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about the vetting process and what that's like, and then I want to talk more about sort of who these folks are. But
so Eric Holder, the former Attorney General under Obama, whose law office is just 2 blocks away from where we're sitting, he and his team are collecting vetting material and are going to do a very rushed vetting process. They have been in touch. They've had Zoom calls early this week with various candidates to start collecting their, tax returns, anything in their record. I'm sure they have people working around the clock to go through all of the, the clips and their video history and watch their debates and see anything they might have ever said about Kamala Harris and on and on. It's interesting because the Harris team initially signaled that it was going to be a very small group of people who were being looked at, like 3 or 4 or 5. And now what they're doing is saying, well, actually it's broader than anyone knows. And we're looking at a dozen people, and they're throwing a lot of names out there. But my interpretation of that is that it's sort of like, you want people to think they're under consideration, and you also want to, there are reasons to say we're looking at Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, or Pete Buttigieg, the Transportation Secretary, and it means that all those people are going to go out there and go be surrogates for you and raise money for you, and so I think that it still is going to be a pretty small group. I would be really surprised if she didn't make a pretty conventional, predictable choice ultimately, but it has been interesting in the last 24 hours to watch them sort of signal that we're looking at William McRaven, the former admiral who was in charge of the raid that took out Osama bin Laden. But I don't think that is real. I think ultimately it will be either Roy Cooper, Josh Shapiro, Mark Kelly, someone of that ilk.
Andy Bashir?
Potentially Andy Bashir, Tim Walz, who we didn't mention, from my home state of Minnesota, the governor. You do have to think about governing partner.
Right, because Trump
just
clearly
like,
chose someone he wants to govern with.
Exactly.
He wants to hang with at the White House.
Right.
And so Harris has to decide, how does she weigh a governing partner along with or counter to who will campaign well, who will market well, who will look good, quote unquote, to the American people.
Yeah, and so I think Roy Cooper. Yeah, I just had to do a ranking of the 6 most likely picks, and I put Roy Cooper as number one for another
your
Washington
day
Post
job, yeah.
product.
Okay, so you put Roy Cooper
I put
first.
Cooper one.
Okay.
And I think, they're both former prosecutors, both former attorneys general. They worked together when he was North Carolina Attorney General. He's been in elected office for a long time, but he has governed as a progressive. He expanded Medicaid in North Carolina. It took years and years, but he comes across as a moderate. He's not threatening. They get along well. They have a good rapport. He's not of Washington. It lets them sort of run as outsiders. I think Harris is making more of a play toward the South and the Sun Belt than the Rust Belt. And I don't think like Roy Cooper helps you win Georgia or anything like that. But I do think it sort of signals moderation, and it signals look toward the southern states, not necessarily the northern states, which is where Biden's path to victory ran through. But Harris has more options than Biden did.
So in this process, as the vetting is happening and the conversations are happening, these folks, guys, because mostly guys, have a chance to audition a little bit, show what they've got. Right. And that can be by going out and being a surrogate on TV, or it can be just by, sprucing up your social media profile a little bit. And this Instagram post by Mark Kelly caught our eye. So let's just roll this. We'll listen to a moment of it, then we can talk over it.
I remember my first flight in the Navy. It was rather unfortunate.
Okay, it does not get more like badass than that. I remember my first flight in the
It's hard to one-up it. It's hard to top.
So he's wearing kind of almost a camo hat. He's sitting in front of the American flag. He's looking kind of casual, relaxed, like he might just crack open a beer right next to him.
Diet Mountain Dew.
Or a Diet Mountain Dew.
Maybe in space. Maybe that'll be the next Instagram video talking about his first flight to space, right?
Yeah, so what is this about?
They're all trying to lean into their strengths. Tim Walz didn't go to outer space, but he was a high school teacher. And someone noted that he's the same age as Kamala Harris, 59. And they said, it's funny because he doesn't have any hair. And he said, well, I ran the lunchroom. I oversaw the lunchroom in the high school. And if, no one would have hair if they had done that. And so I think it's trying to be folksy. He also posted pictures of him eating various state fair food, and it's playing to their strengths. Jared Polis, the governor of Colorado, who is a dark horse in this process, he had a funny line where he was asked about being VP, and he said, well, if they do their polling and it turns out they need a 49-year-old balding gay guy who's from Boulder, Colorado, they know my number. And you have to lean into what you've got.
How does this compare to how candidates for Trump's pick were working it, like how they were trying to audition for it?
Yeah, well, we know that Trump wanted someone who was going to kind of fight on air and defend him, right? That's one of the reasons he picked Vance, right? And I think what's so interesting about this process is it almost throws you back to Iowa before the primary, how they go to the state fair and they're eating. It's very retail politics, very home style, right? Not necessarily a ton of policy or this is what I want to do per se. They'll talk about their record, but they're also just talking about here's how I relate to voters, right?
Likable.
Here's who I am
I'm
as a
likable.
person,
I'm a cool
right?
dude. Yeah.
And there are, we should say, in addition to the Instagram videos, and Mark Kelly got hit by the union movement, organized labor, who said he hasn't sponsored the PRO Act, which is their number one legislative priority. And so just yesterday, Mark Kelly signed on to the PRO Act. And then today, Kamala Harris is campaigning at an American Federation of Teachers event. And she said, I'm going to sign the PRO Act if I'm president. And so, they are trying to position themselves in the right place to please, because I wanted to say when JM was talking, it's for an audience of one, except it's not quite for an audience of one. There are, the people have been critical of some left-leaning outlets like the New Republic criticized Josh Shapiro for some of his comments about Gaza. And so now, he's trying to clean that up because he doesn't want to potentially risk alienating half the Democratic Party. And so they are all trying to be as appealing as possible to Democrats.
As appealing as possible.
Yeah.
Which I think is different than what Republicans were doing,
right.
because that was for an audience of one.
Right.
I mean, those candidates were really appealing to Donald Trump, and they wanted to both be a good attack dog, like you said, but they also needed to assure him that they would not do what Mike Pence did, which was, in Donald Trump's eyes, like abandon him to claim a false election victory. Right. So they were trying to convince him of his loyalty, of their loyalty to him, as well as their ability to go out tough and strong.
Yes.
And so he made a pick, and Kamala Harris will soon make a pick before August 7th. Speaking of how Harris is sort of thinking in this moment and what she's doing, she's starting to develop her message and talk to the voters how she wants to be remembered, what she wants to be her strong points. We talked to our colleague Maeve Reston, who was, she's a political reporter, and she was the pool reporter covering Harris's event in Milwaukee this week. And to hear her describe it was so fascinating because it had to get moved from a modest venue where the vice presidential candidate was going to go out to now the presidential candidate, bigger and bigger, and a huge crowd, energy unlike anything this campaign has seen all season. And let's play some tape of how Harris delivered a message to that crowd in Milwaukee.
Before I was elected vice president, before I was elected United States Senator, I was elected Attorney General of the state of California, and I was a courtroom prosecutor before then. And in those roles, I took on perpetrators of all kinds. Predators who abused women, fraudsters who ripped off consumers, cheaters who broke the rules for their own gain. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
Kamala Harris campaigning in Milwaukee. JM.
It's so interesting right now because there's momentum. Harris has momentum. The Democrats have momentum right now at this moment. And it's also quite a time to have momentum because we are a week removed, roughly, from the RNC when...
I thought those guys had momentum.
Yeah, exactly, right? It's just changing back and forth. But we've heard that now a few times from Harris, even in the past few days, right? Honing this message. It's clearly a base play, right? That is Democratic voters want to hear that sort of message. And I would expect that by the time we get to the final stretch of the campaign, she's going to broaden that a little bit, because I think while it's important for Democrats to hit on, and we've heard them hit on the conviction and Trump's other legal issues, voters we know say economy, immigration, reproductive health, right, among the top issues. So I would expect as we get to the final stretch of the campaign, as she's trying to bring in those undecided, those persuadable voters, that message is going to get broader. But for the moment, what they're trying to do is consolidate that support, energize that support. That was a huge issue that Biden had for months and months, and of the litany of kind of factors that likely
it was
led
just
to
so
this.
frustrating to Democratic voters who wanted, I mean, it's almost like you don't know what you need till you get it. I mean, they knew that they needed someone to go out and attack Trump, but now that they've got it, it's like this huge sense of relief of like they've been dying of thirst and they finally have water. They have wanted and needed this message of not just defending the Biden record or talking about Democratic priorities, but going after Trump, and she is bringing it. Now, it also shows some toughness, which is exactly what we saw a lot of at the RNC. From the RNC at the Republican convention, we saw, like, we were calling it tea night. Like, the last night of the convention was so testosterone filled and macho. And here's Kamala Harris bringing like her prosecutor's version of that, right? Trying to go toe to toe with that brand of toughness. it's such an interesting message, James, at a time when Trump's legal cases are like, they're not even in limbo. They're in like a wasteland. They're beyond, right?
It's been fascinating. So Trump was just on Fox News, and now he has changed his tune about the cases, and he's saying it was Kamala Harris who orchestrated all the charges against me. Biden didn't. It was Harris was writing the indictments, and which is not true. There's no
Nor
evidence
was
of
Biden
that,
doing it either.
Nor was
but-
Biden doing it.
okay.
It's not, the Justice Department is independent, etc. But
Some of the cases are state cases, local.
But it is funny how Trump has now pivoted and is saying Harris is the one who was weaponizing the Justice Department against me.
Is he
and
claiming that she's like the puppet master behind Biden, or that it was her,
he's
like-
heading that direction.
Okay.
It's not that articulate yet, but I presume that's where we're going, is that she was always calling the shots, and that she's the person to blame for every bad thing you don't like. I think that's where Trump's heading.
This is something he does where he sort of tests these messages out at rallies, right? And if you watch maybe a stretch of rallies over a couple weeks,
which you have done many of, spent a lot of time doing.
and he will kind of battle test some of this stuff, and then he'll start to alter it over days or weeks, and then he'll eventually sort of land. And sometimes he'll even just rhetorically ask, or sort of ask the crowd, like, what do they think of this? And he's even said this, like, based on their reaction, he will change his message a little bit. And I think that's what we're seeing right now as he tries to hone this attack on
He is trying to figure it out. It's really interesting that you say that, because we've seen a bunch of House Republicans say already offensive, racist, misogynist things about Kamala Harris, and calling her a DEI hire, making coarse sexual comments. And Mike Johnson and House Republican leaders said in a private meeting on Wednesday, like, don't do that, focus on policy, like that just plays into her hands. And Stephen Chung, the Trump campaign spokesman, was asked about all this yesterday, and he said, we're not going to do that. I mean, obviously Trump can't help himself, and it seems inevitable that he's going to. And one of the things he does when he's testing these messages out is kind of pushing the boundaries and testing the limits to see how far he can go and what the reaction is, and doing it as a question so that he has some plausible deniability. But some
people are saying that
exactly.
I've heard or whatever.
Right.
He does these like leading, like, I don't know.
I've heard this. It's all this. And I mean, that's a good impression, because it is. I think so. I think we're in for some of that, but I think that there is certainly, and we saw last week at the RNC, Trump lacks a lot of discipline in a sustained way. But clearly, I think someone has told Trump, like, don't do anything that plays into her hands. Don't go out there and call her a DEI hire. That doesn't mean he won't do it at some point. But I think they're watching the backlash at the rank and file House Republicans who have said it. And so I imagine the Trump campaign itself wants to be more careful, but there's still 100 days left to say outrageous things.
How far down the list of conversation topics are Trump's legal challenges, JM? Like, are they on? I know they're certainly on the radar of the people who are still working on the cases and Trump's defense lawyers, but what about everybody else?
I mean, it feels like it's fallen a little to the back burner, right? I mean, but that you reference that kind of introductory ad that Harris put out today, right? And in that, it flashes on screen the conviction in New York for Trump. So they know that is a negative. Trump has a lot of negatives with voters. They know that's a negative. So while I guess I would say both, right? Like it is going to fall to the back burner, I think, at least in the interim here, potentially. But that's an issue, right? Just like January 6th is going to continue to be an issue, I think the legal issues are going to continue to be there, and whether it's kind of above the surface or right below the surface, that's going to be there. And I think we should expect Harris to continue to remind voters of that, because it is unprecedented to have a convicted felon running as a major party nominee for president.
Yeah, and we certainly heard from President Biden in his Oval Office address that he's still passionate about democracy. He's still going to have that as a focus, January 6th. But Harris is going to have a different message, right? She's going to try to appeal to other issues that people care about, and we're going to hear a lot of that prosecutor message. So a recap of where Trump's legal issues are. We are still waiting for a sentencing in the New York case. We're looking towards September for that. The classified documents case is gone.
There will be an appeal, but yes,
but
it
is out of the room.
Yeah.
There will be an appeal process. It could certainly come back once that's through, because it's widely believed that Aileen Cannon's judgment will not stand up to scrutiny.
Right.
So that could circle back, but right now it's off the decks.
The next big thing, other than the sentencing in New York in September, is there will be kind of an evidentiary hearing before Tanya Chutkan in the D.C. District Court, where
That's the January 6th
this is the
case.
January 6th case, and she has to make a determination following the Supreme Court's immunity ruling that Trump is protected for official acts. What is and is not an official act, so that they can narrow down Special Counsel Jack Smith's indictment. That has not been scheduled yet. I think it will be interesting, because you're going to have Trump's lawyers arguing with the government's lawyers about what is an official act. And you could see the government introduce evidence to argue something was not an official act that would be revelatory.
That will be the closest we will get to a case against Donald Trump and his actions related to that
Before the election. Yeah.
And then the Georgia case is also on ice right now.
And that is totally on ice, pending an appeal over whether Judge Scott McAfee made the right call in saying that Fani Willis didn't have to be kicked off the case if her former boyfriend, Nathan Wade, left. And so that is now being brought up to the appellate court. And those oral arguments aren't even scheduled until after the election. So
let's say I'm someone who has a very busy calendar over the next few months, because there's like this election happening, and someone might like to take a weekend or two. I'm going to be watching for the September sentencing of Trump, and then the scheduling of Judge Chutkan's hearing.
Yeah.
And then I'm twiddling my thumbs waiting for
I mean, it will be
the election.
For the election. Because the election, and if Trump loses, then these cases will, the Jack Smith will proceed. If he wins, they have said that they're going to keep pushing until January 20th,
Inauguration day.
Which is Inauguration Day. But who knows how it all plays out? And I mean, it will be interesting to see if it is on voters' minds at all in 3 months.
Chutkan has sort of signaled that she's not as concerned about, like, if this case goes to trial, for example, like last week of October.
Yeah, she's trying to work on her own court case. She's not. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
when you say less concerned, she's not fussed by the fact there's a big election coming. Like, she is going to try to keep this case marching forward.
Right. So this whole thing of you can't have investigations, this informal DOJ policy is just that. It's a DOJ policy and it's investigations.
And I'm sorry, you didn't. So close to an election, you can't have.
Usually it's post Labor Day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Post Labor Day, in that stretch before Election Day, that first week in November, you cannot have a investigation. This was the criticism that came down a little bit on Comey and Clinton back, folks might remember, in 2016. But in this case, what experts have told me is that the case going to trial, the case has already been investigated. They're in kind of a trial mode, or these procedural motions and whatnot. So they've said that there's a distinction there. So I don't know that we should totally rule out, it's probably single-digit percentage likelihood that this case comes up, whether it's before Election Day or even in that 2 months after, before inauguration. It is theoretically possible, but to James's point, highly, highly unlikely.
Well, I will keep my calendar open for when Judge Chutkan schedules the next hearing, which will be maybe the closest thing we get to really discussing the evidence of Trump's actions around January 6th. So our last segment, we're circling right back to Veeps and Trump's vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance, and how that pick is going. When we were at the convention, I was hearing people say they liked him well enough. They were happy because Trump liked him. It was sort of like, I love you, son. So if you bring home this girlfriend, she's family to us. Like, I was, it was like a vibe of like, sure, like, bring him in. But now that people are like getting a sense of who he really is, how's the reaction going?
That's a really funny analogy. And it's, I guess
because delegates weren't telling me like, oh, I love J.D. Vance, but they were like, oh, Trump likes him. Like, he wants to be like Trump. He's like cut in Trump's mold. He's good people to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Now your son has brought home a girlfriend who's like saying that she's not a racist because she, people call her a racist because she drinks Diet Mountain Dew.
We better roll that clip, because if people don't know what we're talking about, let's just look. So he's had some tough moments.
Yes.
So let's watch J.D. Vance at a rally where he tried to tell a joke that just kind of landed with the big old thud. Let's watch.
It is the weirdest thing to me. Democrats say that it is racist to believe, well, they say it's racist to do anything. I had a Diet Mountain Dew yesterday and one today. I'm sure they're going to call that racist too, but it's good. I love you guys.
Awkward. So first of all, folks, Diet Mountain Dew is not good. Okay, I do have to and I love Mountain Dew, but Diet Mountain Dew.
Got to do the original Dew.
Yeah, the diet just negates everything beautiful about Mountain Dew. What we're laughing at, though, is that awkward pause in the room. Like, no one's laughing. No one really got it. It kind of landed flat.
Yeah, it was similar to the please clap, Jeb Bush.
Oh, let's play that. Okay, so what you're talking about, let's play that. So that's wow, going back into the archives, 2016, which feels like a lifetime away. 2016, Jeb Bush in New Hampshire asking desperately for some clapping.
We're prepared to act in the national security interests of this country to get back in the business of creating a more peaceful world. Please clap.
Why is that so painful?
Because it reflected that there wasn't the energy, that Trump was sort of stealing the show. That felt like the coughing, dying, whimpering end of the Bush dynasty. And
please clap.
Please, and Jeb was trying to fire up the crowd. I was at that event, and he just, it was one of those raw, unscripted moments that was so revealing about this deeper sort of like the party has moved on. And I think it's certainly surprising to Trump world how much people haven't really cottoned to JD yet.
So what does JD Vance learn from this moment? Like, it sounds like for Jeb Bush, it was this big flashing warning sign about his campaign. How does JD Vance retool his message based on how he's going out and being received by crowds so far?
We were just talking a moment ago about how Trump has a really good ability to kind of read crowds, right? And he kind of plays into it, feeds off of that better than a lot of politicians do, honestly. And Vance, in theory, we're going to see him kind of retool that message, but obviously that is not a great interaction. You could see some of the folks behind him just sort of with blank stares on their faces, being like, when are we getting on with the next part of the speech here? But, the warning signs right now for Vance is that we've gotten 5 quality polls since the pick, and his favorability is underwater in every single one of those, which is pretty unprecedented. If you look at Tim Kaine, if you look at Kamala Harris in 2020, if you look at Mike Pence even in 2016, most of the time these VP candidates have a bit of a honeymoon period where their approval ratings shoot up, and that really hasn't happened with Vance. And there were already warning signs for Vance before Trump picked him, which was in 2022, he ran statewide in Ohio and underperformed all the other Republicans running statewide in Ohio, and most of them won. DeWine won by 26 points. Yost, the attorney general, won by 20. Frank LaRose, Secretary of State, won by 19 points statewide. Vance won by 6 points.
Wow.
Now, some of that you could say is Tim Ryan who ran against him, the Democratic candidate in 2022 for Ohio Senate, was a very strong candidate. And some of it you could say that Vance was his first statewide race running. Maybe he's started to refine some things, and he'll refine some things over time here. But we are only a little over 100 days from Election Day, so there's not much time to do that and to refine that message. So it is a potential warning sign for Trump.
And a word of caution to those people who want to be Kamala Harris's vice president, that once you are named, everyone goes through the archives and finds out everything that you've ever said or thought or done. And that's happening to JD Vance. And so when he did run for office before, he made this comment about miserable cat ladies, and it's getting a lot of play. Let's share that.
Effectively run in this country via the Democrats, via our corporate oligarchs, by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made. And so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too. And it's just a basic fact. You look at Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, AOC, the entire future of the Democrats is controlled by people without children. And how does it make any sense that we've turned our country over to people who don't really have a direct stake in it?
Childless Cat Ladies. That's with Tucker Carlson from Fox News. That's back when he was running for Senate. Oh my goodness gracious.
So what's funny is, it's only 2 years ago. It's not that long ago. It was an incredibly different context where J.D. Vance was in the super crowded Senate field. He had written Hillbilly Elegy, but had made all these anti-Trump comments. And so he was trying desperately to ingratiate himself with Trump world. And his successful strategy for doing so was to befriend Tucker Carlson and Donald Trump Jr. and to get on Tucker Carlson's show. And you get booked on that show, which at the time was the most highly rated show on cable television and has now been canceled, by being outrageous and being provocative. And that helped him get Trump's endorsement, helped him win the Senate primary and a Senate seat.
And it's ultimately helped him become the VP nominee, right? Because of those friendships with Tucker Carlson and Don Jr. have paid off.
Who lobbied for him. But now it's coming home. The chicken is coming home to roost. The cat is coming. They don't have kennels. The cat is coming to the milk.
Claw his eyes out.
The cat is coming to claw the couch.
Okay, so a couple of things, first of all. First of all, Kamala Harris is a stepmother. And in fact, her stepdaughter, the mother of Doug Emhoff's kids, has come out. His ex-wife has come out and said these are baseless attacks for 10 years since their children were teens. Kamala has been a co-parent with Doug and I. So she is a parent of a blended family, which really reflects a lot of America. Right. But also, like, Pete Buttigieg, who now has children, but that's so inappropriate because he's basically calling a gay man a woman, right? And then the whole idea of going after people who don't have children. I mean, it's you can see J.D. Vance almost doing it in the same way he did the Diet Mountain Dew thing, where he's like, this is kind of like funny, snarky, grade school-y. Like, it's kind of a dig, but it's not, it comes back to haunt you.
Yeah. It's the kind of thing that I am sure before he said that on Fox News, he had said it 100 times in like private dinners with donors, like the Peter Thiel types, and that they all got a chuckle out of it. And then you get that reaction, and so then you say it on TV. And I remember the week he said it. But it is. I mean, it obviously is hurtful to people who try to have children and are unable to. And there's a lot of reasons that it. Even Jennifer Aniston came out, someone who's not very political, Rachel from Friends, and had an Instagram story attacking J.D. Vance. And it is one of those things that, because we talked about this a lot during the Republican convention, a majority of people, even though DC sort of knows him and people sort of have the sense of hillbilly elegy, most people don't have a clear sense of him or his politics. And this is one of those defining things. You're like, oh, that's the guy who derisively refers to childless women as cat ladies.
There was that CNN poll in late June that 56% of respondents had never heard of him, right? And so this is a pretty important, crucial kind of define yourself time. And like we just said, when he should be experiencing more of a bump than he is right now. Now, maybe some of that is views are so baked in, we're so hyper partisan nowadays as a country that some of that may be factoring in here. But the other thing here is the Republicans have shed women voters, especially. That is one of the things that cost them in both 2020, but especially in the 2022 midterm elections after the Dobbs ruling came down. They need to, in theory, the conventional wisdom is they need to bring those folks back into the fold at least a little bit to have a chance in some of these key states in November. And those are not the sort of comments that you want out there to bring those folks into the fold.
Or cat owners or dog owners.
That's them too. And what's wild about this is that J.D. Vance is married to this woman, Usha Vance, who is an incredibly successful professional woman who clerked for the Chief Justice, they met at Yale Law School, and is the daughter of immigrants. And the Trump campaign isn't leaning into that part of the story, partly because they saw ugly reaction from the far right to their VP nominee being married to a brown woman, and they have not put their foot forward on that. And they have a good story to tell. You heard some hints of it during the Vance speech at the RNC, where he talked about learning to cook Indian food. I guess maybe that Usha told that story, not J.D. Vance.
that was not something
that was
he
not JD Vance talked about, but she talked about
about
he learned how to make Indian food for my parents
and eat vegetarian for her family, and how
Those
he
were
was
sweet
able
moments.
to adopt and adopt.
And you could
her
feel, you could
parents,
see that resonating with suburban women, and
or anyone,
or anyone,
who likes
But it's-
to cook,
or
likes
any
to
like
eat,
just
or
kind of happy person.
It's also because they think this is going to be a base election, now,
Right.
right? And this is ramp up the base, play to the base, right? And I mean, we've talked kind of ad nauseum about how we think part of the Vance strategy is that blue wall stuff, right? But that's where some of this is coming from.
I'm eyeing you as you drink your Diet Mountain Dew, James.
We don't put anything to waste here.
That's right. That's right. So, Republicans seem frankly furious at Biden dropping out of the race. They had such a good thing going at the convention, attacking Biden on fronts, especially though his age, sort of the concerns that Americans had about his ability to lead. They're now threatening legal action against the Biden-Harris, now Harris campaign. Can they do that?
No. There's no basis for, Joe Biden wasn't even the official nominee of the Democratic Party. There's
Great point.
no basis to keep him off or keep her off the ballot. There's no basis to stop the transfer of money. It is the same campaign operation. That's also one of the reasons no one wanted to stop Kamala Harris. And, I think a lot of this is just messaging, but also it sort of reflects a feeling that they built their strategy around running against Biden. And all of a sudden they're like, trying to figure out on the fly how to run against Harris and do so in a non-offensive way that won't backfire. And I think, when the talk about litigation, I think is as much about messaging. The other thing, after the networks all carried Biden's speech to the country from the Oval Office on Wednesday night, the Trump campaign just said, we demand equal time because this was a political speech. And in fact, it actually was not a very political speech at all. It was a very presidential speech.
Yeah, it's really getting under Trump's skin. And
Clearly.
you can tell that because he's been writing these Truth Social posts that are just really PO'd and frustrated. And it's going to be interesting to see how he...
To your point, yeah, and one of the things he said on Truth Social was he wanted to get a refund for all the money that he spent attacking Biden because Biden is no longer his opponent. Yeah, I mean, I think that is a reflection of someone who doesn't really know the right line of attack to
Just
take.
trying to figure it out. Well, it is on. It's Harris versus Trump. And of course, we had to go through the formal process of her becoming the nominee and accepting the nomination. But at this point, game on. I just accidentally drank some of this Diet Mountain Dew, and I have to say, it is so gross.
It really is.
And I love Mountain Dew.
Not
but
racist, not racist.
It's just gross.
But it is just not good.
The diet with the sugar, with the fake sugar. Get some rest this weekend, but keep your phone near you because the last 2 weekends, there's been a lot of news. I'll probably text you just to say hi because I'm going through Washington Post withdrawal. On behalf of James, JM, and all of us, I'm Libby Casey. Thank you for listening to Sidebar and watching Sidebar. You can hear us on your favorite podcast app and watch us on YouTube. Just look for Washington Post, and we will talk with you next week.